The wind howled through the trees as I turned onto the desolate highway, my tires crunching on the fresh layer of snow that had coated the road. It was a cold, dark winter night, and the swirling flakes of snow made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. But I had to press on. I had no other choice. I had been driving for hours, trying to make my way home after a long trip visiting family for the holidays. The roads had been treacherous since I left their warm and welcoming home, and the snowstorm showed no signs of letting up. I was alone on the highway, my only companions the eerie glow of my headlights and the occasional flash of lightning in the distance. As I drove deeper into the heart of the storm, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The isolation of the highway was starting to get to me. It was as if the world had disappeared, leaving me alone in a frozen, featureless wasteland. I turned up the heat in my car and gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, trying to shake off the growing feeling of dread. The radio crackled with static as I searched for a signal, but there was nothing but white noise. I sighed in frustration and turned it off, leaving me alone with the sound of the wind and the whirring of my tires on the snow-covered road. Suddenly, I saw a faint glimmer of light in my rearview mirror. It was a pair of headlights, approaching fast. I breathed a sigh of relief, grateful for the company on this lonely stretch of highway. As the car drew closer, I could make out its shape, a battered, old sedan. It looked like it had seen better days, but I didn't care. I was just glad to have some company. The car pulled up behind me, and I could see the driver's silhouette through the windshield. They flashed their headlights, and I took it as a signal to pull over. I slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder, and the sedan followed suit, coming to a stop behind me. I rolled down my window and waved to the driver, a middle-aged man with a tired look in his eyes. He rolled down his window as well and leaned over to speak to me. "Hey there," he said, his voice gravelly. "I've been driving for hours, and I could use some company. Mind if I tag along with you for a while?" I smiled and nodded. "Not at all. It's pretty lonely out here." He introduced himself as Tom and pulled his car in behind mine, falling into step with my slow and cautious pace. We chatted about the weather and our respective destinations, and it felt good to have someone to talk to. The sense of isolation that had been weighing on me seemed to lift a little. As we drove on, the snow continued to fall heavily, and the wind howled louder than ever. The road was becoming increasingly treacherous, and I had to concentrate hard to keep my car on track. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as the visibility got worse and worse. Tom and I were the only two cars on the road, and the snowstorm showed no signs of abating. It was as if the world had turned into a frozen, desolate wilderness. I couldn't help but wonder if we had made a mistake by continuing to drive in these conditions. Just as the thought crossed my mind, I noticed something strange up ahead. It was a figure standing in the middle of the road, a shadowy silhouette barely visible through the thick curtain of snow. I slammed on my brakes, and Tom did the same, his car skidding to a stop just behind mine. My heart was racing as I peered through the windshield, trying to make out the figure in the snowstorm. It was a person, a woman by the looks of it, standing alone in the freezing cold. She was dressed in a tattered, white gown that billowed in the wind, and her long, dark hair hung limply around her shoulders. She seemed to be beckoning us closer, waving her arms frantically. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, his voice tinged with fear. I had no idea what to do. It was a dangerous situation, and every instinct told me to stay in my car and keep driving. But something about the woman's desperate appearance tugged at my heartstrings. Maybe she needed help. Maybe she was lost or injured. Without thinking, I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out into the bitter cold. Tom followed suit, and we both approached the woman cautiously. The wind whipped around us, stinging our faces and making it difficult to see. "Are you okay?" I called out to her. She didn't respond, but continued to beckon us forward. It was then that I noticed something odd about her eyes. They were completely white, as if she had no pupils or irises. Fear gripped me, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to see if she needed help. As we got closer, I could see that her gown was stained with blood, and her skin was pale and lifeless. It was clear that something terrible had happened to her. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but before I could make contact, she let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed in the night. Tom and I stumbled back in terror, our hearts pounding. The woman's scream seemed to pierce the very fabric of the storm, and it sent shivers down my spine. She continued to scream, her voice a haunting wail that filled the air. "We need to get out of here," Tom shouted, his face pale with fear. I nodded in agreement, and we both scrambled back to our cars. The woman's screams seemed to follow us, growing louder and more chilling with each passing moment. I could feel a sense of malevolence in the air, as if the very night itself had turned against us. We jumped back into our cars and slammed the doors shut, fumbling to start the engines. The woman's screams continued to reverberate through the storm, and I could see her approaching us, her ghostly figure drawing nearer and nearer. I floored the gas pedal and my car lurched forward, tires spinning on the slick road. Tom's car roared to life as well, and we sped away from the nightmarish scene, leaving the woman behind in the swirling snow. As we drove on, the storm showed no signs of letting up, and the fear and dread that had gripped me earlier returned with a vengeance. Tom and I didn't speak a word to each other, but I could see the terror in his eyes, mirrored in my own. We drove for what felt like hours, the highway stretching on endlessly through the frozen wilderness. The snowstorm raged on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something malevolent was out there in the darkness, waiting for us. Finally, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw the faint glow of city lights in the distance. We had reached civilization, and the storm began to recede, giving way to a clear, starry sky. The sense of relief was overwhelming, and I let out a shaky breath. Tom and I pulled into a gas station, and I turned off my car's engine. We sat there in silence for a moment, still shaken by the night's events. Finally, Tom turned to me, his voice trembling. "We need to report what we saw," he said, his eyes filled with fear. I nodded in agreement, and we both got out of our cars and went inside the gas station. The attendant looked at us with concern as we told him about the woman in the snowstorm, about her white eyes and blood-stained gown, about her piercing screams. The attendant's face grew pale, and he told us a chilling story. He said that the stretch of highway we had been driving on was known for strange and unexplained occurrences, that people had reported seeing the same woman before, always in the midst of a snowstorm, always beckoning for help. But no one had ever been able to help her, and those who had tried had never been seen again. Tom and I exchanged horrified glances. We had narrowly escaped a fate that was too terrible to contemplate. As we left the gas station, the storm continued to rage outside, but it felt different now, as if it had lost its malevolent power. We drove on, putting as much distance as we could between us and that accursed stretch of highway. The city lights grew brighter, and the night grew quieter. But the memory of that nightmarish encounter would stay with me forever, a chilling reminder that sometimes the road less traveled can lead to horrors beyond imagination. The sun hung low in the sky as I and my two friends, Mike and Dave, set out on our annual fishing trip to Lake Blackwood. Tucked deep within the woods, it was a place of serenity and beauty, or so we thought. Little did we know that this trip would become a chilling tale we'd never forget. The drive to the lake was long and winding, taking us deeper into the heart of the dense forest. Towering pines surrounded us, casting eerie shadows on the narrow road. As the car crunched over gravel and leaves, a sense of isolation began to creep over us. We were miles away from civilization. Arriving at the lake, we were greeted by the tranquil sight of the sun-dappled water. Our excitement over the weekend ahead drowned out any lingering unease. We parked our truck by the water's edge, unloading our fishing gear, and began setting up camp. The air was thick with the earthy scent of the forest, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. We spent the day casting our lines into the calm waters of Lake Blackwood, sharing stories and laughter. It was a perfect escape from our busy lives, a chance to reconnect with nature and with each other. As the sun dipped below the treetops, we decided to call it a day and set up a campfire for the night. Around the flickering flames, the forest seemed to come alive with eerie rustlings and distant hoots of owls. We brushed it off as the usual sounds of the wilderness, but a lingering unease clung to us. Dave, always the skeptic, started to tell us about the legend surrounding Lake Blackwood. Supposedly, he began, there's an old Native American legend about this place. They say it's cursed, that strange things happen here. Mike chuckled, taking a swig from his flask. Come on, Dave. You don't believe in that stuff, do you? Dave shrugged, his face shadowed by the fire's glow. I don't know, man, but they say that sometimes people disappear around these parts and are never seen again. We laughed it off, attributing it to the usual campfire ghost stories. But the laughter didn't erase the unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. We decided to turn in for the night, each of us retreating to our tents with a flashlight in hand. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness beyond the campfire's glow. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the legends had gotten under my skin. Closing my eyes, I tried to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was awakened by a sound. It was a soft, eerie melody, a haunting tune that seemed to float through the trees. I unzipped my tent and peered out into the moonlit forest, my heart pounding in my chest. The melody grew louder, drawing me deeper into the woods. I couldn't resist its eerie allure. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the lake. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the haunting tune, making my way through the dense underbrush. As I neared the lake, I froze in my tracks. There, on the water's edge, was a figure. It was a woman, her pale, ethereal beauty illuminated by the moonlight. She was sitting on a rock, her long, dark hair cascading down her back. She was singing the haunting melody, her voice like a siren's call. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. It was as if I was in a trance, drawn inexorably toward her. I took a step closer, and then another, my feet moving of their own accord. The woman turned to me, her eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. They were the same eyes Dave had mentioned, eyes that seemed to see right through me. As I reached the water's edge, the woman reached out her hand to me, her voice now a soft, seductive whisper. Come to me, she murmured, her lips parting in a sinister smile. I was on the verge of stepping into the water when a strong hand grabbed my shoulder, yanking me back. It was Dave, his face pale with fear. What are you doing? He hissed, his grip on my shoulder tightening. I tore my gaze away from the woman and blinked in confusion. I don't know. I couldn't help myself. Dave shook his head, his eyes filled with terror. We need to get out of here, now. We stumbled back to our campsite, leaving the mysterious woman by the lake. Mike was still asleep in his tent, unaware of the eerie encounter we had just experienced. Dave and I didn't bother waking him. We needed to get as far away from Lake Blackwood as possible. As we packed up our camp in a frenzy, the forest seemed to close in around us. The once tranquil woods now felt menacing, as if they were hiding some terrible secret. The eerie melody continued to echo in my mind, haunting me. Finally, we piled into our truck and sped away from the cursed lake, leaving it behind in the darkness. The further we got from Lake Blackwood, the more the feeling of dread lifted. We didn't speak of the encounter, as if acknowledging it would make it all the more real. It wasn't until we reached the safety of civilization that Dave finally spoke up. I told you, man. There's something about that place. It's not right. I couldn't argue with him. What we had experienced was beyond explanation, beyond reason. It was a chilling reminder that sometimes the beauty of nature can hide the darkest of secrets, and Lake Blackwood was a place we would never forget, a place forever etched in our memories as a real-life horror story. I've spent most of my life on the road, hauling freight from one end of the country to the other. I've seen my fair share of strange and unsettling things, but there's one night that still haunts my dreams, even after all these years. It was back in the winter of 1990 when I was a young truck driver, fresh-faced and full of ambition. I was on a long haul through the Midwest, somewhere in the desolate stretches of Kansas. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, and the highway was nothing but a white ribbon disappearing into the darkness. My rig, a battered old Freightliner, rumbled along, its headlights cutting through the falling flakes. I had been driving for hours and was starting to feel the fatigue set in. The road was monotonous, and the snowstorm showed no signs of letting up. I knew I needed to find a place to rest soon, but there was nothing but empty fields and frozen fields on either side of the highway. Just when I was about to give in to the exhaustion and pull over on the shoulder, I saw the faint glow of a neon sign up ahead. It was a motel, a little oasis in the frozen wasteland. I couldn't believe my luck. I signaled and pulled off the highway, the crunch of my tires on the snow-covered gravel a welcome sound. The motel was a small, run-down affair, a relic of a bygone era. The sign out front read the Lone Star Motel, and it buzzed and flickered in the night. I parked my truck in the empty lot and went inside to check in. The man behind the counter was an older fellow, with a weathered face and a crooked smile. He looked like he'd seen his fair share of travelers pass through over the years. "Evening, stranger," he said, his voice gravelly. "You're lucky you found us. Not many folks stop by this time of year." I nodded and handed him my driver's license and a wad of cash for the room. He gave me a key and pointed me to my cabin, which was located at the far end of the motel grounds. The cabin was a small, one-room affair with wood-paneled walls and a musty smell that told me it hadn't been used in quite some time. But it was warm, and that's all I cared about at that point. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the creaky bed, fully clothed. As I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the place. The wind howled outside, and the old building creaked and groaned in response. But it was more than just the usual sounds of an old motel. It was as if the very walls themselves held a sense of foreboding. I tried to put it out of my mind and close my eyes, hoping to get some rest before hitting the road again in the morning. But sleep was elusive, and my mind kept drifting back to the strange feeling that had settled over me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash outside. I sat up, my heart racing, and listened intently. There were more sounds, like footsteps crunching in the snow, and low, guttural voices speaking in hushed tones. I knew I should stay put, but curiosity got the better of me. I got up and peered out the window, and what I saw sent a shiver down my spine. A group of people, dressed in tattered clothing and hoods, were gathered around a fire in the center of the motel courtyard. They looked like something out of a nightmare, their faces hidden in the shadows of their hoods. They were chanting in a language I couldn't understand, and the flames danced and flickered with an otherworldly intensity. I watched in horror as one of the figures produced a small, wriggling animal from a sack and threw it onto the fire. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream as it burned, and the others in the group began to chant louder, their voices rising in a macabre chorus. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the grisly scene, my mind struggling to process what I was witnessing. It was like something out of a nightmare, and I couldn't believe it was real. As the flames died down and the chanting ceased, the figures began to disperse, disappearing into the night. I watched them go, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching my cabin. I rushed away from the window and hid in the darkness, my breath coming fast and shallow. The footsteps grew closer, and then I heard a low, raspy voice just outside my door. "Come out, trucker," the voice whispered, sending a chill down my spine. "We know you're in there." I stayed silent, my mind racing. There was no way I was going to open that door. But the voice grew more insistent, more menacing. "Come out, or we'll come in," it hissed. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped, with no way to escape. I reached for my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. It was as if the motel was in its own little world, cut off from the outside. The minutes ticked by, and the voice outside grew angrier and more desperate. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door either. It was a standoff, a battle of wills in the dead of night. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains. The voice outside grew quieter, more distant, until it finally faded away completely. I stayed hidden in my cabin until I was sure it was safe to come out. When I finally ventured outside, the motel courtyard was empty, and the fire pit had burned down to a smoldering heap of ashes. I wasted no time in packing up my things and getting back on the road. I didn't stop until I was miles away from that cursed motel, and I didn't look back. To this day, I have no idea who those people were or what they were doing in that remote motel in the dead of night. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never forget that night as long as I live. It was a brush with something dark and malevolent, something that should have stayed in the realm of nightmares. And it's a memory that still haunts me, even after all these years on the road.